Hey, it's Brett, and this is Brett and Some Books. Today we are continuing and concluding Who Ate the First Oyster by Cody Cassidy. This is the final chapter, Who Discovered Hawaii. If the time of our species on Earth were a day, this happened 5 minutes before midnight, 1,000 years ago. From one perspective, the out of Africa history of modern Homo sapiens is one of global expansion and exploration. It began approximately 55,000 years ago when modern Homo sapiens burst forth from Africa across the Sinai Peninsula and into the Middle East, spreading in a diaspora across Europe and Asia. Some went north, migrating through the European continent, and, based on the evidence of a fossilized human jawbone, made it to England using a land bridge by 41,000 years ago. Another group went south. They passed through India and through Southeast Asia and across the now submerged land bridges between the Indonesian islands of Sumatra, Java, and Bali, until a deep sea trench east of Borneo called the Wallace Line halted their progress. Even with the seas nearly 300 feet lower than today, passage across the Wallace Line required boats. Yet, judging by Homo sapiens' teeth on the island of Flores, archaeologists believe these Homo sapien boaters crossed the Wallace Line at least 46,000 years ago, and by 40,000 years ago were through Australia and to the bottom of Tasmania. Another group moved east. They traveled across Asia and populated Japan by 40,000 years ago, moved north of the 60th parallel, above which no previous hominin had ever survived, into western Siberia, and crossed onto the Beringia landmass by 32,000 years ago. The massive ice sheets of Canada blocked their passage south until 16,000 years ago, when the earth warmed and the ice melted. Once beyond Canada, the first Americans reached the bottom of South America within a millennium. By 4,000 years ago, humans landed upon the eastern edge of Arctic Canada and Greenland. By 3,000 years ago, modern humans occupied nearly the entire habitable planet. Only the lush, remote islands of the South Pacific remained vacant. After the early boaters crossed the Wallace Line nearly 45,000 years ago, they continued east. At first, the islands were so close that a person standing on the beach could see the next one. These tightly packed isles provided what Professor of Archaeology at the University of Auckland Geoffrey Irwin calls a voyaging nursery, where boaters developed their crafts and navigational techniques in the relative safety of the vast archipelagos. Using basic sailboats, these early adventurers hopped islands until they reached the Solomon Isles, just east of Papua New Guinea. Past the Solomons, however, the islands of the South Pacific become increasingly sparse. The next island is Vanuatu, which is separated from the Solomons by a daunting 300 miles of open ocean. The distance halted all human progress into the eastern Pacific for thousands of years, until perhaps human history's most voracious explorers, archaeologists call them the Lapido culture, burst south from Taiwan approximately 3,000 years ago. Little evidence remains of the Lapida's boats, but scholars speculate they may have invented the outrigger canoe, which provided an increased stabilization and improved their performance into the wind. Using their outriggers, the Lapita moved through the Solomons, discovered Vanuatu, and then sailed beyond. Within 400 years, they discovered Fiji, West Polynesia, Tonga, and Samoa. They hopped islands so quickly, archaeologists believe the only possible explanation for their movements is the desire to explore. According to Irwin, they went because they wanted to see what was over the horizon. Eventually, the vastness of the remote Pacific stalled even the Lapita. Beyond Samoa, scattered and distant, are the islands of New Zealand, the Cook Islands, Tahiti, the Marquesas Islands, Easter Island, Hawaii, and finally the coast of South Africa, South America. The distances are measured in the thousands of miles, and the voyages required large boats, months at sea, and expert navigators. Yet, by 1,200 years ago, the Polynesian culture overcame these incredible stretches of open ocean. Polynesians sailing to the south discovered the Cook Islands and then New Zealand. Others went east, first to Tahiti, then to the Marquesas, Easter Island, and finally, proven by the presence of sweet potatoes in New Zealand, they reached the Chilean coast of South America. Sweet potatoes are native only to the Americas, and their presence in Polynesian farms in New Zealand proves at least a group of Polynesian explorers not only visited South America, but maintained trading relationships across nearly 6,000 miles of open ocean. But of all their navigational accomplishments, the Polynesian discovery of Hawaii stands as perhaps the greatest feat of exploration in human history. Hawaii is the world's most isolated archipelago. It's a geologic hiccup in a vast stretch of nothing. It's so far from anywhere that many European explorers, upon discovering it occupied, believed its discoverers must have been shipwrecked. But computer simulations, archaeological discoveries, and recreations of the voyage have removed all doubt. The history of Hawaii was no accident. Not only is there no evidence for that theory, but according to the archaeologist Scott Fitzpatrick, simulations of the Pacific's trade winds and currents suggest that an undirected voyage, regardless of its land of origin, would eventually have zero chance of landing on Hawaii. Early Western theories of Hawaii's accidental discovery had it backward. Hawaii's isolation isn't the reason it must have been found accidentally, it's the reason why it couldn't have been. According to Fitzpatrick, Hawaii could have only been discovered on a direct search using a fast boat departing in the early fall months, most likely from the Marquesas. In other words, the colonizers of the South Pacific were epic seafaring explorers, and whoever discovered Hawaii may have been the greatest of them all. Who was it? I'll call him Captain Kirk, after the great Star Trek explorer of new worlds. Kirk was born nearly 1,000 years ago in the Marquesas Islands, which are themselves an isolated island chain 2,300 miles southeast of Hawaii. Very few contemporaneous accounts exist of Marquesan culture. Early Polynesians of Kirk's era didn't use a writing system, and when European missionaries arrived in the 18th century, their diseases, primarily smallpox, killed 98% of the local inhabitants. As a result, much of what anthropologists know about this ancient navigating culture has been pieced together from archaeological evidence, diary entries by some of the first Europeans to visit, neighboring Polynesian cultures, and the topography of the islands themselves. The Marquesan Islanders were pastoralists and fishermen, not hunter-gatherers. Kirk raised domesticated pigs and chickens, cultivated breadfruit, taro, and yams, and fished and gathered shellfish along the plentiful reefs of the Marquesas. His clothing was simple. The islands are tropical and warm year-round, so Kirk may have worn as little as a bark cloth loin wrap, but he decorated almost every other aspect of his appearance. In 1774, Charles Clerk, a sailor aboard James Cook's famous expedition to the South Pacific, wrote that the Marquesans were tattooed from head to foot in the prettiest manner that can be conceived. Marquesans took their tattoos seriously as expressions of their culture and religious beliefs, and received them throughout their lives. Tattoo artists were full-time professionals who punched charcoal ink into the skin with bone needles and a hammer stick. Their clients paid them in food, goods, and services, and their artistry was both expensive and painful. The Marquesan word for tattoo was tattoo, and when the European sailors returned home, they adopted both the art and the word. Kirk would almost certainly have been heavily tattooed, with pierced ears hung with ivory. On special occasions, he wore flowers, a headdress of rooster tails, or a crown made of porpoise teeth, so elaborate it took weeks to make. He decorated everything he used, since the Marquesans Islanders believed that art wasn't just aesthetic, it was a means to communicate with their many gods. He may also have been a musician. Marquesans played nose flutes, and European explorers' account suggests the men often serenaded women from outside their window like lovesick teenagers, using nose flutes instead of boom boxes and guitars. Kirk was, no doubt, a warrior as well. The Marquesas are high, dry islands with mountains that rise to form steep-walled, protected valleys. High islands are notoriously violent. The walls inhibit communication among groups, and the isolated communities can easily devolve into incessant revenge killings. Their battles were far smaller in scope and casualties compared to the organized, state-sponsored warfare of 20th century Europe, but anthropologists' observations have found the ceaseless violence often resulted in per capita homicide rates 5 times that of even 20th century Europe. As a consequence of the violence, Kirk may have practiced human sacrifice and perhaps cannibalism. Early anthropologist reports suggest both occurred on the Marquesas, and according to the political scientist James Paine, human sacrifice is a predictable result of endemic violence. Despite stereotypes, its practice was far from unique in the South Pacific or their regions. Virtually every major religion has practiced ritual killing at one time or another, according to Paine, because the practice has little to do with the teachings of a particular religion and is instead a system of chronic violence. According to Paine, frequent violence has the dual effect of cheapening the value of life and, because of its ubiquity, convincing citizens their gods must favor it. If life is cheap, the theory holds, paying one for God's favor seems affordable. More than a warrior, farmer, fisherman, or musician, though, Kirk was a sailor. Early Polynesians had largely abandoned long-distance voyages by the time Captain Cook arrived in Hawaii in 1779, so there are few sources to tell us how Kirk learned navigation. But from the accounts of Tupaya, a Tahitian navigator who rode aboard Cook's Endeavour, and the stories and experiences of the traditional navigator Maupayolog, who was born in 1932 on the Micronesian island of Sarawal, scholars have been able to piece together a likely story. Kirk may have learned to sail from his father or grandfather, as did Pialug, who began his education when his grandfather taught him the ports, winds, and currents of the South Pacific. Kirk would have learned to navigate using stars, and judging by Tupaya's first-hand accounts, Kirk's education was more akin to a PhD in astronomy than learning constellations by the fire. While aboard Captain Cook's HMS Endeavour, Tupaya informed Cook of the bearings, sailing times, uh, dangerous reefs, harbors, chiefs on all of the Society Islands, Austral Islands, Cook Islands, Samoa, Tonga, Tokelau, and Fiji. Contemporary accounts differ, but Tupaia either drew or dictated a map from memory that covered 10 million square miles of the South Pacific and its 130 islands. Joseph Mara, a midshipman on the Endeavour, described Tupaia as a man of real genius, which is high praise from a group not known for their open-mindedness toward foreign cultures. Because there was no writing in Polynesian culture, nor any maps, Kirk would have had to memorize a prodigious amount of information. He had to know the stars and their arcs. He had to know what seasons they appeared and when they disappeared, and what stars made their zeniths above which islands. Of the Polynesian navigational ability, Cook wrote, "The clever ones among them will tell in what part of the heavens they are to be seen in any month when they are above their horizon. They know also the time of their annual appearing and disappearing to a great nicety, far greater than would be easily believed by a European astronomer." Elder navigators would have tested Kirk on the water. He would have been sent on solo navigations where losing one's way would have meant certain death. He would have sailed frequently to the neighboring islands in the Marquesas chain, and even likely traversed the 850-mile crossing to Tahiti. His boat is sometimes called a canoe, but I think something is lost in the English translation, and it has led to a misunderstanding of Polynesian sailing capabilities that may have allowed the undirected float theory to propagate. A canoe in English is something you use for a day outings on a flat lake, but that's a far cry from Kirk's craft. Kirk's canoe, based on uncovered ancient hulls and oral histories, was an 80-foot double-hulled catamaran complete with a stove, at least 2 sails, and a shelter on deck. It was a formidable craft I'll call the Enterprise. Kirk built the Enterprise's hulls from the massive tamanu tree and deepened their planks to increase the carrying capacity. He wove coconut husks for rigging and made giant sails out of matted palm tree leaves. Scholars believe constructing these enormous boats required so many resources. Island exploration was not merely a side pursuit of the Polynesian culture, but an organizing principle. The finished Enterprise could hold 40 people and enough food and water stored in coconut shells to last for months. The water alone would have weighed more than 10,000 pounds. Enterprise would have been capable of carrying an island occupation starter kit, including breeding pairs of pigs, chickens, sweet potatoes, yams, breadfruit, and seeds, but on Kirk's initial voyages of exploration, would have been so failure would have been so frequent, he would have likely taken only the crew and supplies he needed to complete a search. By middle age, Kirk was an experienced open ocean navigator. He may have already sailed both east to Easter Island and west to Tahiti and the Cook Islands. But on the voyage on which he discovered Hawaii, he decided to sail north. The Polynesians knew of no land in that direction, leaving his inspiration a mystery. Perhaps, as the archaeologist Patrick Kirch proposes in his book, "A shark going inland is my chief," the flight of a bird, the Pacific golden plover, caught his eye. The Pacific golden plover is a small brown and yellow checkered bird that forages along beaches and tidal flats. For 6 months it makes its home in the Marquesas, before it flies north in April. 6 months later the bird returns. When Captain Cook observed the plover flying above his ship in 1778, he noted in his journal, "Does plover flying above his ship Does this not indicate there must be land to the north where these birds retired in the proper season to breed? Kirk might have asked himself the same question nearly a millennium before. Yet, in this observation, he was lucky. The plover's remarkable migration does not stop in Hawaii, but continues unabated to the coast of Alaska. Still, its flight north could have inspired hope of a distant island. According to simulations of Kirk's voyage performed by Fitzpatrick's weather models, Kirk would have stood on the best chance of discovering Hawaii if he departed in November, when the trade winds are favorable. If he left any time other than the fall, the models give him no chance of sailing the required distance before he would have had to return home. As Kirk sailed, he navigated by tracking his latitude and longitude. Calculating his latitude is relatively straightforward. Kirk simply measured the apex of the night stars or the noon sun and above the horizon. Estimating his longitude was another matter entirely. To do so, he likely used a method of navigation sailors grimly referred to as dead reckoning, which simply means he determined his location by the direction of the winds, swells, the flight path of migrating birds, the positions of the stars, the arc of the sun, and by estimating his speed through the water while taking into account the currents. Necessarily, this rules out sleep. Modern dead reckoners stay at the tiller for 22 hours a day and rely on a trusted mate for the remainder, in order to track their speed and the current. As he sailed, Kirk would be on the careful lookout for indications of a nearby island. Near-shore birds, a refracting swell, sea turtles, floating debris, or a stack of clouds piling up on the horizon could have alerted him to the presence of land. Given typical conditions, computer simulations estimate Kirk may have averaged 3 knots on his journey, which means after 24 days he may have spotted gulls, a change in the swell angle, or clouds stacking up against Hawaii's nearly 14,000-foot Mauna Kea. Nobody knows where Kirk made his first landfall. Captain Cook chose Kauai's Waihine Bay on the first voyage, and the big islands Kealakekua Bay for his second, but wherever Kirk disembarked, he would have found an astonishing Eden. Conchs the sizes of dinner plates littered the reefs, and large flightless birds made for easy meals. Yet he probably didn't stay for long. Most scholars believe Polynesian's initial voyages were exploratory, as Kirk likely refilled his supplies, confirmed it was a habitable island, and returned home. Navigationally, his return would have been the more perilous. After a month of sailing, he would have arrived at the proper latitude, but then would have faced a terrible choice. Was he east of the Marquesas or west? Kirk's dilemma was referred to by sailors until the late 17th century as the problem of longitude, which refers to the lack of celestial clues the sky offers a sailor to their east to west location, save for the imperceptible differences in the time of the sun's rise and set, modernly experienced as differences in or jet lag. If Kirk made a small error in the calculations of his speed or current, or if a storm blew him off course, he could have easily made the wrong choice and sailed toward certain death. His life depended on every observation he had taken on his voyage to keep him from sailing into oblivion. 700 years after Kirk, the British Commodore George Anson found himself in this exact predicament while captaining the Centurion. Storms below Tierra del Fuego had disoriented his navigation and waylaid his ship, and as his crew died of scurvy, he searched for respite in the Juan Fernandez Islands. He captained his ship to the proper latitude, but no longer sure of his longitude, didn't know whether to sail east or west. He chose both, spending days zigzagging off the coast of hostile Chile, while his crew died before he found port. 80 of his crew died before he found port. When Captain Cook himself sought the Marquesas Islands, he relied upon the previous measurements by Captain Alvaro de Mendaña, who had been the first European to arrive there in 1595. Mendaña had noticed the correct latitude of the islands, but his longitude allowed for a 685-mile margin of error, a margin approximately the width of the state of Texas. Cook found the islands because he originated from a location he knew was east of the Marquesas, which meant he simply sailed to the proper latitude and then straight west until he sighted land, a technique known as sailing down the longitude. Because Kirk was returning from the north, this would not have been an option. When he reached the proper latitude, he would not have had time to sail down a Texas-size error in his estimate. He would have had to know whether to sail east or whether to sail west. European sailors were unable to measure their longitude until 1761, when an English clockmaker named John Harrison constructed a watch that could keep stunningly accurate time for months. How Kirk did it is somewhat of a mystery. Some scholars speculate that he may have even had a way of determining longitude by some unknown, long-lost technique developed over thousands of years of isolated colonization. As Irwin writes in Voyaging and Settlement, it's possible these great navigators were aware of the zenith stars of many islands and could form an algorithm that allowed a sailor to sail west of the home without fear. Once Kirk returned to the Marquesas, it's likely he led a colonizing group back, perhaps in several boats, each carrying 40 people along with the animals and seeds they would need to start a new colony. When they arrived back on Hawaii, the carbon record suggests they burned vast tracts of forest for their farms and hunted the island's large flightless birds to extinction within a generation. The virgin territory and fertile land sparked a population explosion. By the time Cook arrived, nearly 800 years later, an estimated 500,000 people lived on the islands. As for Kirk, he probably continued sailing. For centuries, the eastern Polynesian islands kept in contact with each other. Polynesian oral histories tell the stories of ancient navigators who sailed between Tahiti and Hawaii, and there are ancient stone tools on Tahiti made from Hawaiian rocks. But eventually, the tradition died off. Perhaps, as Kirk proposes, once the Hawaiian population reached a certain threshold, they refocused their efforts on inter-island sailing. Dozens of boats greeted Cook as he sailed into Kauai, but none of them were on the scale of the Enterprise. Yet, even though the ancient catamarans were gone, Cook himself had no doubts regarding the Polynesians' navigational abilities. He always believed their colonization had been intentional. In 2014, archaeologists found a small piece of skull in a cave in Israel dated 55,000 years old. This small piece of bone represents the beginning of modern Homo sapiens exploration of the habitable globe. 54,000 years later, Kirk's discoveries represented the end. And that is the end of the chapter and the end of the book. So if you haven't read or heard the other chapters, this is a playlist you can check out and like and subscribe for more. Check out what else I've got. There's a lot of stuff I've read at this point.